Last September, a friend of mine invited me to stay at her vacation home in the Geil Valley, in Austria's southernmost region of Carinthia, pretty much right on the border with Italy. It's just a few hours away by train, and I hadn't seen her in a while, so I threw some things into my backpack and hopped on a railjet. It's still early on in September, so summer hasn't quite left us yet, although when I arrive, greet my friend and her dad, and I'm told we're going to have to wait for some other friends of hers who are arriving on a different train, I do need to put on a jacket. I mean, it is the mountains after all. On the car ride from the train station to her place, I get to know her dad for the first time. He's probably the closest I've ever come to seeing the phrase jolly old fellow in real life. Round glasses, hair that doesn't care it's graying, some remark too funny to be categorized as a dad joke, yet too obvious to be categorized as not always on his lips. From time to time he cranks down the window of his old dusty Ford and lights himself a cigarette. Pure, unadulterated joie de vivre personified. When we get to their place, a beautifully ramshackle old thing that looks like it's been a part of the countryside since the countryside was made, he tells us to throw our bags on the stairs. He's decided we're going to get pizza. Get turns out to be a turn of phrase. The tiny village only has one restaurant, and it hasn't figured out how to do takeaway yet. So we sit down outside and watch the sunset over the Geil Valley Alps. My friend starts telling us about a trip she went on with some of her friends, which everyone at the dinner table but me seems to know. I find my attention slipping, as it so easily does in a place like Carinthia, to our surroundings. The view of the evening sky painted red, the mountains silhouetted like cold dark shadows against its warmth, is something that just pulls me in. But maybe it's also that I'm a historian, and that I can never quite lay that to rest. I turn to my friend's dad, who's sitting next to me. That's the border right there, isn't it? You're right next to Italy down here. I never really grew up next to borders, and in the moment it strikes me how strangely contrived it feels, that there's an invisible line going across those mountain peaks, and if you cross it, suddenly the whole system of government changes. My friend's dad doesn't seem so perturbed by it, though. Yes, it is, he said. But the people in the valley on the other side of those mountains don't actually speak Italian. They speak Windish. It's a Slavic language, kind of like a dialect of Slovenian. They don't start speaking Italian until the next valley over. The poor fellow doesn't know it, but now he's really got my attention. I've never heard of a group of people called the Windish, or Winds, or however they're called. I knew nothing about them. But I did know that there was a Slovenian-speaking minority in southern Carinthia, right about in the area where we were in, and if you drove 20 minutes down the road, you'd reach the border to Slovenia. So I knew that this was an area in which 3 languages met, and that the distribution of these languages didn't adhere to the borders of the states which meet in this region. But could it be that things were even more complex? Fortunately for my friend's dad, before I could ask him any more questions, my friend reminded us that we still had to choose our pizzas. In a matter of seconds, any and all questions about ethnic groups and borders fled my head, replaced by questions about salami, rucola, and anchovies. But the idea that there was a 4th group living in this area stuck with me. I didn't know it at the time, but I would soon learn that this idea is among the most controversial concepts in Austrian history. What I was about to learn is that the term Windish is the centerpiece of a nationalist narrative that dates back to the 19th century, which itself is part of a debate between politicians and academics, as well as the regular people who live in this region. Ultimately, that debate isn't just about which language is spoken in which mountain valley. It's not just about whether something is a dialect of one language or a language of its own. At its core, this story is about a new answer to that old question of whose land is this land? Part 4. The Windish Theory. The second time I ever heard about the Windish was actually while I was brainstorming ideas for this podcast. I told my colleagues that I wanted to do one case study per episode, and one of them, Susie, just blurted out that I could do one on the Windischen Theorie, the Windish theory. The Windish theory? It's only the second time I'd ever heard the name, and now they're referred to not as a people, but a theory. Susie elaborated. The theory of the Windish was an attempt by Austrian and German nationalists to categorize the Slovenes living in Carinthia not as being Slovenian, but that their dialect was different enough that it could be considered their own group. Because, if they weren't Slovenian, that means they didn't necessarily have to be a part of Slovenia. Right. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Just over 100 years ago, after the Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, there was a referendum in southern Carinthia which gave the Slovenian-speaking population there the choice to either stay a part of what was by then only the German-speaking parts of Austria, or join what became known as Yugoslavia, the state in which the remainder of the Slovenian population now lived. Whose land is this land? Now, this isn't just the story of how Susie came to do the research for this episode. It's the moment I decided I wanted to examine this matter further. Later that week, when I was visiting one of my professors who specializes in Eastern European history during his office hours, I asked him about the Windish, or the Windish theory. He confirmed to me that it was one of the most sensitive topics in Austrian historiography. To quote him, "Imposed identities always are." But he also said that not just was there disagreement among the academics, but that there were also disagreements between the people these academics ascribed the label Windish to. So, wait, does that mean that some of the people that this term is meant to describe self-identify with that term, but others don't? I felt like this story had just gotten even more complex, and I thought it was time for me to do my own research. Or rather, let Susie do the research for me. So, let's go back to the beginning. Or rather, as it always is in history, a beginning. Before the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when we talk about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's important to note that this is a political entity that is not a nation-state. While nationalism was on the rise during the 19th century, Austria-Hungary was a multinational political entity. Quite simply, that's because the empire was a product of a time before nationalism, when kings and queens ruled countries based on claims of tradition and divine right, not popular consent. What was later rechristened the Austro-Hungarian Empire had evolved out of a conglomerate of feudal lands whose main connection was that they were all ruled by the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs. We've met them before, remember? Over the course of the early modern era, its rulers integrated their territories administratively and financially. Their empire eventually came to encompass all of present-day Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as parts of Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, Italy, and Montenegro. It possessed a population of over 50 million people from diverse ethnic or national backgrounds, including Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Croats, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Serbs, Italians, and many, many more. Over the course of the 19th century, however, as the idea that ethnic groups should have their own states began to spread and gain traction in the minds of so many Europeans, many began to see the Habsburg state as a doomed entity. Nationalist activists got to work in all parts of the country, trying to define and categorize the various peoples of the empire into ethnic groups. These efforts were not without their challenges, especially in areas with two or more ethnic groups. Languages and populations coexisted side by side, raising questions as to how the people living in these transitional or multi-ethnic spaces should be classified. One of these quote-unquote problem areas was southern Carinthia, the homeland of a group of people referred to sometimes as Carinthian Slovenes, sometimes as the Windish. But what does that term even mean, Windish? It has a common root with the German word Wends, a term used to refer to Lusatian Sorbs in eastern Germany, another Slavic-speaking group of people. Both are terms that are thought to have been used by German speakers to refer to the Slavs in general, back in the early Middle Ages. Before the 19th century, Windish was most likely used by German speakers in Carinthia as a term for Slovenes who lived to the north of the Karawanks, the part of the Alps that today separates Carinthia from Slovenia. This geographic term then was carried over into the 19th century, the cradle of European nationalism, and was reimagined as a label for Slovenian speakers from north of the Karawanks as an ethnic group. With this new meaning came new connotations. Whereas before referring to someone with the term Windish didn't carry any sort of connotations, when on both sides of the then still imagined border, nationalism became more pronounced in society, German-speaking Carinthians started to look down on their Slovene neighbors, and Windish became a derogatory term, one used to imply that the Slovenian-speaking population was rural and unsophisticated. But that's not all. In a time when nationalists were busy imagining how the borders of their desired nation-states should look like, the question arose of which nation, on which side of the Karawanks, do the Windish belong to? Are they Slovenians, or are they Germans? But wait, Germans? See, there's something you need to know about the people living in Carinthia not speaking a Slavic language. They have in the past seen themselves as both Austrians and Germans. Austria itself was the name of the first feudal land that the Habsburg ruled. The people there spoke German. During the 19th century, many German speakers in the Habsburg Empire came to identify themselves as ethnically German. After the First World War, Austrians were divided over how to see themselves, as ethnic Germans or ethnic Austrians. Many of the former wanted Austria to become a part of Germany. This idea of Austro-German unity was received well among a considerable number of Austrians who did not believe that the newly founded republic could survive on its own. And this question was initially resolved in favor of German-identifying Austrians when Hitler incorporated Austria into Germany in the Anschluss of 1938, which many Austrian citizens approved of at that time. However, after the Second World War, in light of the events which had transpired during and before the war, a separate Austrian identity began to develop as a means to distance the small European state from the actions and the ideology of the Nazis. In the decades following the war, Austrians initially sought to cast themselves as Hitler's, quote, first victim, ostensibly to distance themselves from the crimes which many Austrian citizens had committed during the time of the regime. Only in the 1980s would Austrians begin to systematically engage themselves critically with their country's past during the war. During this time, however, over the course of the latter half of the 20th century, a sense of an Austrian ethnic or national identity had also begun to develop, based on a shared cultural heritage specific to Austria. For example, its shared dialect of the German language and the various regional subdialects, and its many particular traditions. So, when I speak about Austrians and Germans in this episode, remember that I'm telling you how individual German speakers from the territory of what is today Austria self-identified. Now back to the question of the Windish. Or, rather, how it came about. As the 20th century approached, German nationalists had found a solution to the question of which nation the so-called Windish belonged to. By exaggerating the linguistic differences between Standard Slovenian and the dialects spoken in Carinthia, these academics laid the foundation for what lies at the core of the Windish theory. They claimed that over time, the Slovenian minority in Carinthia had quote-unquote naturally assimilated to the German-speaking majority, and in consequence developed a quote-unquote mixed language, Mischsprache in German, which was unique to the area of southern Carinthia, and was made up in equal parts from features of both languages. And when Susie, who is herself a linguist, was researching this, she told me that this felt like social Darwinism to her. And for all of you who don't pay attention to early 20th century sociology, this is the idea that, much like in the natural world, human groups compete with one another and the fittest ends up surviving. Or rather, that their culture ends up overcoming other, supposedly weaker cultures. And I've got to say, her conception of this made sense to me. German nationalists believed that the Windish had adapted to the superior German language and culture. Social Darwinists believed that this would happen, that supposedly inferior cultures would be wiped out by their supposedly superior neighbors. Think about it. They're not saying that German speakers close to this border have taken over Slovenian words. They're saying that Slovenians are taking on parts of the German language, but not vice versa. They're saying that this is a unidirectional phenomenon. But at the same time, it's also important to note that these German nationalists did not think that the Windish had become German, either in a biological racist understanding or a cultural one. They granted them the status of an in-between group, one not quite Slovenian, but also not quite German either. At the time, the Windish theory seemed to be backed by the fact that indeed, substantial groups of Carinthian Slovenes struggled to understand standard Slovene speakers. Today, historians would argue that this was most likely due to the fact that Slovenian had only been standardized in the 18th and 19th century, and people living in rural Carinthia, often lacking any sort of formal education, had little to no opportunity to be exposed to this relatively new form of the language that was primarily used in Slovenian academia, administration, and literature. Proponents of the theory of a hybrid language, however, argued that the Windish dialect had adapted in a way that made it closer to the German than the Slovenian language. And, okay, at this point, there's one thing I think we should keep in mind. When we're talking about speakers of this Slovenian dialect in Carinthia, no matter what we call them, we're talking about the population of a predominantly rural area. These people lived far away from Europe's capitals, where academics eagerly discussed their language and ethnicity. Just like we saw in Transylvania, there's also a local, popular dimension to this debate. And, just like with Eastern Rome and the label Byzantine, we're talking about an exonym here, a label applied from the outside to a group. No matter what nationalist academics theorized, we need to look at the local level to see what the people in the region actually think about this whole discourse, and if it even matters to them. The first clear-cut instance of being able to measure this comes after the First World War. Now, as a side note here, I also want to point out that although at this point the idea of a group that was some sort of mixture between German and Slovenian speakers had already been established by this point, the terms Slovenian and Windish were still being used more or less interchangeably. We're going to meet the man who finally coined the distinction between the two, but he wouldn't do so until the late 1920s. Right, so, World War I is over. The Habsburg Empire is crumbling into separate entities, shaped after the principles of the nation-state. The American President Woodrow Wilson, heavily influenced by nationalist principles, demands that referendums be held so that the populations of Europe can decide which state they want to live in. His allies only let him do this in a couple of instances. South Carinthia is one of them. In 1920, southern Carinthians were given a choice. The districts of Bleiburg, Verlach, Rosek, and Völkerbach, a region which was around 70% Slovenian-speaking, could either remain a part of the German-speaking part of the Habsburg Empire, the Republic of Austria, or join the newly formed Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, colloquially known and later renamed as Yugoslavia. The result of this plebiscite was that 59% voted to be part of the Republic of Austria. And now for a part of my own national history that I never really paid that much attention to. Granted, I have spent most of my life living outside of Austria, but I never really understood how important this event has remained to many people in Carinthia. Just 3 years ago, in 2020, the federal state of Carinthia pulled out all the stops to celebrate its 100-year anniversary. Despite an ongoing pandemic, public events were held, exhibitions and media initiatives planned, as were workshops and competitions in schools. The state also doled out research grants to help commemorate the event. Austrian, or should I say German, nationalists, it becomes hard to categorize in the interwar years. But anyway, they had obviously wanted southern Carinthia to remain a part of their country. And to celebrate, or rather justify this outcome, they referred back to their social Darwinist argument. They said that the Carinthian Slovenes who had voted to remain a part of Austria were more, quote-unquote, advanced in the process of assimilation into the majority culture. The other Slovene speakers must therefore have been closer to their Slavic neighbors. Here, we can suddenly see the idea of a distinction between different types of Carinthian Slovenes being created. And it was this distinction that was canonized in 1927 by the German nationalist historian Martin Wutte. Wutte was the one who created the separate categories of Slovene and Windish. Notably, Witte himself was born and raised in Carinthia, self-identified as a German nationalist, and later became a dedicated Nazi. So, it makes sense that he would be a proponent of both southern Carinthia remaining a part of Austria and interpreting the results of the referendum from a social Darwinist perspective. It was Witte who was responsible for summarizing and expanding existing theories on the Windish. According to him, the Windish were Slovenes who were quote-unquote German-friendly, which, as time went on, would come to refer to not just the German language, but Germanness in general. For Witte, the Windish provide an ideological antipode to the stereotype of the Slovene, which was emerging in Austria at the time. Slovenes, according to Witte, were anti-German, pro-Yugoslav, pro-partisan, and pro-communist, all of which, of course, held negative connotations for the Nazi author, as well as the society he was writing in. Witte's publication, German, Windish, Slovenian, also touches on a range of political questions that were topical at the time. For instance, during negotiations with the Carinthian Slovene population which followed the referendum, Austrian officials wanted to introduce a registry for Slovene-speaking Carinthians, which Carinthian Slovene representatives strongly opposed, fearing persecution. What's more, the Carinthian Slovene representatives knew that this fear was widespread amongst those Carinthian Slovenes who were more inclined towards Yugoslavia. That would mean that these Carinthian Slovenes most likely simply wouldn't register themselves, which would lead to the impression that there were less Slovenian-speaking inhabitants of Carinthia than there actually were, which in turn would give their representatives less power in future negotiations. Witte made a similar prediction, but argued that if Carinthian Slovenes really did refuse to register, it would be beneficial to Austrian officials. Specifically, he speculated that instead of the 50,000 individuals that were estimated to actually identify as Slovenian, only about 15,000 would list their names in the registry. And see, for Witte, this would have been a good thing, because a smaller number of officially registered Carinthian Slovenians means that the Carinthian Slovenian minority would carry less political weight. It was a point which would prove so contentious to both negotiating parties that it grounded the talks between them to a halt in 1929. This episode shows us how closely the idea of the existence of the Windish was linked to the political movements and ideologies of the time. And perhaps this can be said of any academic theory, but I have to wonder in how far the Windish theory would even be a matter for discussion among academics if the political events which surrounded it historically hadn't taken place. Firstly, the dissolution of the old Habsburg Empire into smaller, nationally minded entities, followed shortly thereafter by the Carinthian referendum, a plebiscite whose political salience remained very high due to the fact that the negotiations which followed it went on for such a long time. And again, we need to remember that the concept of the Windish being a separate ethnic group, speaking a separate language, and being linked to specific cultural and political values was only canonized in 1927, after the referendum had already taken place, and while negotiations on what its outcome should mean were still actively being discussed. As I have already pointed out to you numerous times, nationalism and ethnicity are historically and socially constructed concepts. But in this case, we are dealing with a construct which can be traced back to one specific historian. Regardless, it prevailed all the same. Up until this day, the term Windish carries some kind of meaning to Carinthian Slovenes. To some of them, Windish is the insult it was turned into in the 19th century. To others, in an interesting reinterpretation of Witte's definition, Windish is a derogatory term for Slovenian-speaking individuals who try to assimilate into German-speaking or Austrian culture and neglect their Slovenian heritage. At this point, the research we've made had changed my perspective on this historical dilemma, certainly from what I'd spoken to my friend's dad in the Gail Valley, but also from the conversation I'd had with my Eastern European history professor. He'd said that there was disagreement within the population in question as to whether or not the term should be used. In light of everything I've read, it feels like a pretty clear-cut case of an identity being thrust upon people from outside. An exonym. There didn't seem to be anyone who self-identified as Windish. But that's when I came across Catherine Hunter. Just like me, she was a grad student. Back in the 1990s, she read and translated Slovenian sources on the Windish theory and published the results in her master's thesis. She found that in the late 1990s, there was a part of the Slovenian-speaking population of Carinthia who referred to themselves as Windish, without any negative connotations. Coincidentally, they all came from the Geil Valley, the place I had first heard about the Windish theory. About them? What do we even call them now? These people, she says, used their Slovenian dialect when with family and friends and spoke German in more public contexts. The residents of the Geil Valley, just like my friend's dad, will tell you that their language, the language they speak at home, differs significantly from standard Slovenian, and that it originated from the close contact between German and Slovenian speakers who lived together in this region. These Windish speakers in the Geil Valley also believe that their dialect doesn't have a quote-unquote true grammar, which, as my linguist researcher Susie was quick to point out, again shows that they do not see a strong connection of their language to either standardized Slovenian or German. Susie also proposed that this could hint at the fact that the idea of a Windish language, even when used to refer to oneself, is still subconsciously connected to the idea of inferiority, as usually languages with a standardized grammar are seen as more prestigious among multilingual speakers. Now, this certainly tracks with how many nationalist academics conceive of languages, and which languages they consider to be superior to others, but at the same time I think that this may be projecting how these urban academics conceive of languages onto the rural population of southern Carinthia. Then again, given how politicized this topic has become, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this view of the matter had permeated deep into the consciousness of the people in question. But it does get at another aspect of this story. If the concept of a Windish ethnic group was created and applied to these people from outside, as a tool in an argument between Vienna and Ljubljana, between German and Slovene-speaking academics, over whose land this land in the south of Carinthia was, how did that affect the people living in this land, speaking this dialect language, however they referred to it? Because, see, another reading of people using one language at home and another language in their public life is not that they feel more closely connected to this publicly spoken language, but that they fear being seen as identifying with the language they speak at home. Fear, in other words, to be seen as such by the linguistic majority. In modern literature, Carinthian Slovenes are often grouped into being either politically or nationally quote-unquote conscious or quote-unquote unconscious. In other words, they're seen as preferring to either remain a part of Austria or not. Simultaneously, it has been noticed that estimates on the actual size of the Carinthian Slovene population vary considerably. One explanation could be that people do not want to be categorized as Carinthian Slovenians for fear of persecution. A fear which isn't exactly baseless. The issue of whether place name signs should be bilingual, for example, led to German-speaking activists dismantling, vandalizing, or even destroying place name signs when they were first introduced in the 1970s. Ever since, the issue has been subject of many legal battles, with the Austrian Constitutional Court finally ruling that bilingual road signs are permissible in certain circumstances. However, despite this ruling, the issue still remains sensitive in Carinthia to this day. In this context, proclaiming that one is not Slovene could seem as a way out from possible persecution, and the self-identification as Windish provided just that way out. This is when I truly understand what my professor meant when he said that this is such a delicate topic, because this is where I hit a dead end in my inquiries. See, the thought I'm now faced with is that the people who self-identify as Windish may be doing so out of fear. And that's something I never thought I'd encounter. I've been interested in nationalism and ethnicity for a while now, but I've never come across an exonym being internalized by a group of people because they fear describing themselves the way they actually want to. And even if this weren't the case, even if they weren't afraid of anything and their identity as Windish is something that they embrace happily, well, aside from never being able to know that for certain, even if people were to happily think of themselves as Windish, wouldn't that mean that their ancestors first adopted the label out of fear before passing it down to them? What does that say about this whole topic? An identity first adopted to protect oneself from persecution, which over the generations morphed into a genuine feeling of belonging, how can one respectfully engage with that reality? But, of course, this is all just an academic exercise. There's no evidence to say that this is what happened. There is one more detail that I'd wanted to bring into this episode at some point. The Upper Canale Valley in Italy. It's the valley south of the Gail Valley, south of the village I ate pizza with my friend and her dad when I first heard the term Windish. In this valley, in the surroundings of the town of Ugovica, people speak the same Slovene dialect as they do in the Gail Valley. And they too conceive of their dialect as having significant linguistic deviations from standard Slovenian. The difference is that they live in Italy, where they can't be subject to Austrian persecution. Is that proof that there are some people who self-identify as Windish, just like my professor had told me, but not out of any fear? Well, the Canale Valley only became part of Italy after World War I. Before that, it was part of the Habsburg Empire, which means that its inhabitants were just as exposed to the polarized national debate of the 19th century as the residents of southern Carinthia were. But above all else, there's something that I can't ignore at this point. I'm nervous. All of this is making me nervous. Now, I know that I've been researching nationalism and ethnicity for some time now, but I've never been this nervous while I've been doing an episode. And it's not just me. Susie told me that she felt really uncomfortable researching it, because the stakes are really high for us right now. If I had gotten any details wrong or missed anything during the Transylvania or Netherlands or Byzantium episodes, I would have been accused of being a bad historian. But that would have been it. I would have been branded an ignorant outsider who didn't study the society he was analyzing enough. Here, it's different. If I get something wrong, if I don't find all the literature that's out there or misread any of it, I could be labeled as a nationalist. Me, who's doing his best here to show how all nationalisms are just social and historical constructs. If I don't do a good enough job here, worst case scenario, I come across as peddling my nationality's nationalist perspective on the issue of having an opinion on whose land this land should be. Even though all that we wanted to show you is how this debate and its various narratives have been created in the first place. It's not something that I'd ever thought would become a thing and an obstacle for me in doing history and doing historical research. I'd always thought of this as being something, where you go into sources and you look at what you find and you be as objective as you possibly can and write down your findings. But I'm feeling that despite trying to do my best here, my emotions are coming into play. What I'm trying to say is that all of this is making me anxious. It's making Susie anxious as well. And she's the one who's researched this topic. I'm relying on her here for my sources. But anyway, neither of us is good at analyzing sources when we're anxious. It's really weird, but I have to come to face the fact that, well, I'm a human and humans are not rational animals. We are very much emotional animals, and here my identity as a human being, as an individual who's part of a social context, it's the first time that it's interfered with what I want to research. And that's something you're listening to me figure out as I go along recording this right now. And I know some people might hate me for saying this, but I feel like the most important lesson that I learned making this episode is that even as a historian, I am never above the fray. Never. Try as much as we will to present ourselves as objective analysts of events, we historians still all come from social and historical contexts ourselves. We're all part of the historiography, and we need to recognize that. Keep an open mind, first of all, that some subconscious biases that are social contexts and our upbringings implanted on us may still be at work within us somewhere which we aren't aware of. That, and being aware of the fact that perhaps researching stuff while you feel anxious, while you feel nervous, pressured, might have some sort of impact on your ability to perform as an analyst itself. But regardless of that, even if I overcome all of this, if I manage to do a good job, and if I manage to overcome all of my subconscious biases, it doesn't matter that my aim with this episode was to show how nationalist historians and sociologists, writing from national capitals, can affect the lives of people living in multilingual, multicultural border regions. I'm speaking these words from just such a national capital. Regardless of my intentions, my actions will still have consequences for the people I'm writing about. And I've never even met them. Which is why I'm going to stop this episode here. I don't feel like I want to give any sort of judgment on this topic, any sort of conclusion on how to see this phenomenon, this identity, this theory, whatever you will call it, of being Windish. All I want to say is that I hope that everyone down there is okay, and everyone can be who they want to be. Good night. This podcast was written and researched by Jasmin Rippinger and Susanne Schmalwieser. It was recorded and edited by me, Coleman Marshik. The music was composed by Matthias Cantini, and all artwork was designed by Andrew Holt.